Judge Frank Caprio finally had enough, because Pam Bondi pushed the conversation just a little too far, but then something unexpected happened. Let's see what happened. The session was supposed to be routine, just another day in court. Inside the courtroom, everything appeared calm and orderly. The quiet murmur of conversations echoed softly through the room as attorneys prepared their materials. Papers rustled, pens tapped against legal pads, and the faint shuffle of footsteps filled the otherwise controlled environment. It was the kind of atmosphere that often surrounds legal proceedings, professional, measured, and focused. Observers filled the wooden benches along the back of the courtroom, some leaning forward with curiosity, while others quietly watched the preparation unfold. A few reporters had taken their seats as well, notebooks ready, anticipating that the hearing might provide a few noteworthy moments. Near the walls, cameras had been carefully positioned to capture the proceedings. Their presence was a reminder that courtrooms today often exist not just for those physically present, but also for viewers who might later watch the exchange from afar. At the center of it all, presiding over the courtroom from the bench, sat Frank Caprio. For many people familiar with the legal world, Caprio was more than just a judge. Over the years, he had built a reputation that extended far beyond the courtroom itself. Known for his calm demeanor and thoughtful approach to cases, Caprio often carried himself with a quiet confidence that set the tone for the entire room. He was not the type of judge who rushed proceedings. Instead, he preferred to listen carefully. Attorneys were usually given the opportunity to fully explain their arguments before he responded. His patience had become one of his defining traits. Those who had appeared before him before often described the experience as firm but fair. He believed that every side deserved to be heard. But even judges, known for patience, sometimes encounter moments that test that reputation. And on this particular day, something about the discussion unfolding in the courtroom was beginning to feel different. Among those present was Pam Bondi, the former Florida attorney general whose name was widely recognized in legal and political circles. Bondi had spent years navigating complex legal battles and high-profile cases. Her experience had shaped a courtroom style that was both confident and direct. When she spoke, people listened. She had a way of presenting arguments clearly, structuring her points with precision and authority. Years of legal practice had taught her how to hold the room's attention, and she carried that presence with her into every appearance. As the hearing began, Bondi stood and started outlining her position. Her voice was steady. Her argument moved step by step through the legal framework surrounding the issue being discussed. She referenced prior cases, cited legal standards, and emphasized why she believed her interpretation of the law should guide the court's decision. At first, the exchange between attorney and judge followed a familiar rhythm. Bondi would present a point. Judge Caprio would listen. Occasionally he would ask a question, not aggressively, but thoughtfully, encouraging clarification or inviting further explanation. It was a process that anyone familiar with courtrooms would immediately recognize. But as the minutes passed, subtle changes began to appear in the tone of the conversation. Bondi's arguments grew more detailed, expanding beyond the narrow technical points and into broader implications. She began emphasizing the larger consequences that she believed the court's decision could have. For a moment, the shift was almost imperceptible. Some observers continued jotting notes, others simply watched quietly. Yet for those paying close attention, something about the dynamic between Bondi and the judge was slowly evolving. Judge Caprio remained composed, but he leaned slightly forward in his chair, a small movement that suggested he was focusing more intently on the argument being presented. His expression remained calm, but attentive. Bondi, meanwhile, continued pressing forward with confidence. Her tone was respectful, but assertive. She moved through each part of her reasoning carefully, occasionally pausing to emphasize a point she believed was especially important. The courtroom remained quiet except for the sound of her voice, but the tension in the room was beginning to shift. It wasn't the kind of tension that comes from raised voices or dramatic confrontations. Instead, it was the quieter kind, the type that builds gradually when two experienced legal minds are examining the same issue from different perspectives. Observers along the benches started to notice it. A few people subtly leaned forward. Some reporters lifted their heads from their notebooks, watching the exchange more closely now. The conversation itself remained professional. There were no interruptions, no dramatic objections. Yet the tone of the discussion was becoming more intense with each passing minute. Bondi continued presenting her argument with unwavering confidence, laying out each point as though she were carefully constructing a case, brick by brick. Judge Caprio listened, occasionally nodding slightly, but offering fewer questions than before to some in the room. The silence from the bench felt meaningful. It suggested that the judge was weighing each statement carefully. The atmosphere inside the courtroom, once relaxed and routine, had now shifted into something far more focused. Every word mattered. Every pause carried weight. And slowly, almost without anyone realizing it at first, the exchange between Frank Caprio and Pam Bondi began to feel less like a standard courtroom discussion, and more like the build-up to a moment that everyone in the room would remember. As Pam Bondi continued outlining her position, her voice carried the same confidence and clarity that had defined her argument from the beginning of the hearing. She moved carefully through the points she believed were most important, step by step. She explained her reasoning, referring to previous court decisions and legal standards that she argued supported her position. Each reference was delivered with precision, the kind that comes from years of experience standing in courtrooms and defending complex legal arguments. Bondi also expanded on the broader implications of the issue being debated. In her view, the court's decision would not only affect the case directly in front of them, but could also influence how similar cases might be interpreted in the future. She spoke about policy concerns and the potential ripple effects that certain interpretations of the law might create. Too many listening in the courtroom. The argument sounded thorough and carefully constructed. It wasn't unusual for attorneys to frame their cases in a wider context, especially when they believed the outcome could set an important precedent at the bench. Frank Caprio remained quiet for most of the exchange. He leaned back slightly in his chair, his posture relaxed but attentive. His hands were folded in front of him as he listened, occasionally glancing down at notes or documents placed on the desk before him. His expression revealed very little. Judges often develop a neutral demeanor during hearings, and Caprio was no exception. Years of presiding over cases had taught him the value of listening fully before responding. From the outside, it appeared that he was carefully weighing every word. Bondi continued speaking, expanding on the legal framework she believed supported her argument. She emphasized how previous rulings, when interpreted correctly, pointed toward a specific conclusion. Her tone remained respectful, but it also carried determination. Each sentence seemed to build upon the last, reinforcing the narrative she was presenting to the court. For several minutes, the rhythm of the courtroom stayed steady. Bondi spoke. The judge listened. Observers watched quietly from the benches. But then something happened that shifted the atmosphere in a way that everyone present could feel. At one point during her explanation, Bondi made a statement that appeared to test the limits of the judge's patience. The exact wording itself wasn't explosive. There were no raised voices, no accusations, no dramatic declarations. To someone hearing only the words without the surrounding context, it might have sounded like just another routine legal argument, the kind attorneys make every day in courtrooms across the country. Yet inside the room, something subtle changed. It was almost impossible to pinpoint the exact second when the shift occurred, but several people later described the same moment. Judge Caprio's posture changed. Instead of leaning back, he slowly leaned forward toward the bench. It was a small movement, but one that immediately caught the attention of those watching closely. His hands, which had been calmly folded, separated slightly as he focused more intently on what was being said. Bondi continued speaking for another moment, finishing her sentence. Then the judge raised one hand slightly. It wasn't an aggressive gesture, it was simply a signal, the universal courtroom indication that he intended to interrupt. Almost instantly, Bondi paused. The effect on the courtroom was immediate. The quiet murmur that sometimes accompanies legal proceedings disappeared completely. No one shuffled papers. No one whispered to a colleague. Even the subtle background noises, the creaking of benches, the scratching of pens, seemed to vanish. All attention turned toward the bench. For the first time since the hearing had begun, Judge Caprio spoke with a tone that carried unmistakable firmness. The shift in tone alone was enough to signal that something important was happening. Those seated in the gallery instinctively leaned forward. Reporters, who had been casually taking notes, now focused closely on the exchange. Bondi stood still, waiting. In courtrooms, interruptions from a judge often carry weight. They can clarify a legal point, redirect an argument, or address something that the court believes requires immediate attention, and the way Judge Caprio had chosen to step in made it clear that this was one of those moments. The judge's expression remained controlled, but his words, and the timing of his interruption, suggested that he wanted to address something before the discussion moved any further. For a brief moment, the room seemed suspended in silence. Everyone present understood that the tone of the hearing had changed. What had begun as a routine legal discussion was now moving into a more serious exchange between two experienced figures in the legal world, and, as the judge prepared to speak, one thing had become obvious to everyone in the courtroom. This was no longer just another ordinary moment in the hearing. Something significant was about to unfold. When the silence settled across the courtroom, Frank Caprio finally spoke. His voice was calm, controlled, and measured, the kind of tone that judges develop after years of presiding over difficult cases and intense legal arguments. But beneath that calm delivery was a firmness that immediately captured everyone's attention. He looked directly toward Pam Bondi. As he began to respond, Caprio acknowledged that attorneys have every right and even a responsibility to argue their cases passionately. Courtrooms, after all, are places where strong arguments are expected. Lawyers are trained to advocate fiercely for their positions, to present every legal angle that might support their case. But he then added something important. Passion, he explained, must always stay within the boundaries of the courtroom. Those boundaries exist for a reason. A courtroom is not a stage for political debate or public commentary. It is a place where legal arguments must remain focused on the law itself, the statutes, the precedents, and the facts that apply to the matter being examined. As Caprio spoke, his words were careful and deliberate. There was no anger in his voice. He did not raise his tone or appear frustrated, but the message carried unmistakable weight. Years of experience had given Caprio a quiet authority that filled the room without the need for dramatic gestures. His calm demeanor only made his statement more powerful. He explained that the purpose of the hearing was straightforward. Court was there to examine specific legal questions. Nothing more. Nothing less. In other words, the discussion needed to remain focused on the precise legal issues before the court, rather than expanding into broader interpretations or speculative arguments about policy and politics. While attorneys often bring wider perspectives into their arguments, Caprio made it clear that the court's role was much narrower. The law itself had to remain the center of the discussion. As the judge spoke, the courtroom remained completely silent. No one moved. Observers seated on the wooden benches watched the exchange closely, sensing that they were witnessing a moment that stood out from the usual rhythm of courtroom proceedings. At the front of the room, Bondi listened carefully. Her posture remained composed. She didn't interrupt or attempt to respond immediately. Instead, she allowed the judge to finish explaining his point, maintaining the kind of professional restraint that experienced attorneys often show when a judge chooses to redirect the discussion. For a brief moment, the exchange paused. The silence that followed felt heavy. Some people in the gallery later said they could feel the tension in the air. Not the loud kind of tension that comes with arguments or raised voices, but the quieter kind that appears when two highly experienced legal figures are standing firmly behind their perspectives. Bondi had clearly prepared her argument carefully, and Judge Caprio had clearly decided that the discussion needed to remain tightly focused on the legal framework of the case. It was a subtle but important difference in approach. From the outside, the exchange remained respectful. Neither side appeared confrontational. Yet everyone in the room understood that this moment carried significance. Moments like this are not uncommon in courtrooms, but they are rarely so visible. Judges occasionally step in when they believe an argument is drifting too far from the legal issue at hand. When that happens, the judge's role is not to shut down the discussion entirely, but to guide it back to the central questions the court must answer. And that seemed to be exactly what Caprio was doing. His intervention did not escalate the situation. In fact, it appeared designed to prevent escalation by calmly clarifying the limits of the discussion. He was reinforcing the structure that keeps courtroom debates productive and focused. Still, the moment left a clear impression. For those watching closely, it was evident that the judge had reached a point where he felt it was necessary to step in and draw a line, not out of frustration, not out of hostility, but out of a sense of responsibility to the courtroom itself. Judges are ultimately responsible for maintaining order during proceedings, and that includes ensuring that discussions remain centered on the law. Caprio's decision to intervene reflected that responsibility. The courtroom remained quiet for another moment as his words settled in. Observers exchanged quick glances, reporters scribbled notes. The energy in the room had shifted, even if the conversation itself remained calm and professional. It was one of those moments that reminded everyone present of something fundamental about the legal system. Courtrooms are places where arguments can be passionate and intense. Attorneys fight hard for their positions, but at the end of the day, the judge is the one responsible for keeping the discussion grounded in the law. And in that moment, Judge Frank Caprio had made it clear that the boundaries of the courtroom still mattered. After the judge finished speaking, The atmosphere inside the courtroom shifted once again. For a few seconds, the room remained completely still. The words spoken from the bench seemed to linger in the air, and everyone present could sense that the hearing had just passed through a significant moment. Then, slowly, the tension that had built up began to ease. At the center of the exchange stood Pam Bondi, who had been presenting her argument, when Frank Caprio decided to intervene. Bondi listened attentively as the judge concluded his remarks. When he finished, she nodded slightly in acknowledgement, a small but clear sign that she understood the direction the court wanted the discussion to take. Experienced attorneys often know that moments like this require adjustment rather than resistance. And Bondi, who had spent years navigating high-pressure legal environments, responded with the kind of professionalism that courtroom veterans recognize immediately. Rather than pushing back against the judge's comments, she recalibrated her approach. When she began speaking again, her argument shifted back toward the narrow legal questions that had originally brought the case before the court. She focused on the specific statutes and legal precedents relevant to the issue. The broader policy discussions that had briefly entered the conversation were set aside. The hearing resumed, but something about the room had changed. Even though the discussion had returned to legal details, everyone present understood that they had just witnessed a moment that stood out from the usual flow of courtroom proceedings. On the benches behind the attorneys' tables, several reporters quietly exchanged glances. Some leaned toward each other briefly, whispering a few quick observations before returning their attention to the front of the room, their notebooks filled with fresh notes, capturing what had just happened. For journalists who regularly cover court proceedings, interruptions from judges are not entirely unusual, but the context and tone of this one made it notable. Judge Caprio, after all, had built a reputation over many years as a judge who often allowed attorneys significant room to present their arguments. He was known for listening carefully and rarely stepping in unless he believed it was absolutely necessary. Because of that reputation, his decision to interrupt the discussion carried extra meaning. Observers in the courtroom seemed to recognize that as well. Some leaned back in their seats, quietly processing what they had just seen. Others continued, watching closely, curious about how the rest of the hearing would unfold, now that the tone had shifted. As Bondi continued presenting her revised argument, the rhythm of the hearing slowly returned. Questions from the bench resumed. References to legal precedents filled the discussion. The careful, structured language of courtroom debate once again dominated the room, yet the earlier moment lingered in people's minds. Even though the hearing moved forward, the interruption had already become the defining moment of the session. Later, when recordings of the hearing began circulating among legal analysts and observers, the exchange between Caprio and Bondi quickly drew attention. Different viewers interpreted the moment in different ways. Some saw it as a straightforward example of a judge protecting the structure and purpose of the courtroom. From that perspective, Caprio's decision to step in simply reflected his responsibility to keep the discussion centered on legal arguments rather than broader commentary. Others viewed the exchange as a natural result of how passionate legal debates sometimes unfold. When experienced attorneys argue complex issues, the conversation can occasionally drift toward the edges of broader political or policy discussions. Judges, in turn, sometimes intervene to guide the conversation back to its legal foundation. In that sense, the moment between Caprio and Bondi was not necessarily a conflict, but rather a demonstration of how courtroom dynamics work. Two experienced professionals, each focused on their role, briefly crossed paths in a way that required clarification, and once that clarification occurred, the proceedings continued. But even with those different interpretations, one thing remained consistent. Everyone agreed that the moment stood out. Courtrooms often move through long hours of discussion without any single moment drawing particular attention. This hearing had been moving along that same steady path until the interruption changed the energy in the room. From that point forward, the exchange became the moment people remembered. Reporters later highlighted it in their summaries of the session. Legal commentators referenced it when discussing the hearing. And observers who had been present in the courtroom continued talking about it long after the proceedings had ended. It wasn't dramatic in the traditional sense. There were no raised voices, no heated arguments, no explosive confrontation. Yet sometimes the most memorable moments in a courtroom are the quiet ones, a simple interruption, a carefully chosen statement, a reminder about the boundaries that guide legal debate. And on that day, the brief exchange between Frank Caprio and Pam Bondi became exactly that. the moment that everyone who witnessed the hearing would remember long after the session ended. Eventually, the hearing began moving toward its conclusion. After the earlier exchange, the discussion returned to the steady rhythm that most courtroom proceedings follow. Legal points were clarified, documents were referenced, and both sides were given the opportunity to complete their arguments. For several more minutes, the focus remained firmly on the technical details of the case. At the bench, Frank Caprio listened carefully as the final statements were presented. His expression remained composed, the same calm demeanor he had maintained throughout the entire hearing. Across the courtroom, Pam Bondi and the other attorneys wrapped up their presentations. The structured back and forth that defines legal debate gradually came to an end. When the final argument was completed, the courtroom grew quiet again. Judge Caprio looked down briefly at the notes in front of him before raising his head to address the room with the same measured tone he had used throughout the hearing. He thanked the attorneys for their participation and professionalism. He acknowledged the effort both sides had put into presenting their positions and recognized the complexity of the issues that had been discussed. Then he delivered the conclusion that often marks the end of many court hearings. The court, he explained, would take the matter under consideration rather than issuing an immediate decision. The judge would review the arguments, examine the legal authorities cited by both sides, and issue a written ruling at a later time. To those familiar with the legal system, that statement sounded completely routine. Judges frequently reserve their decisions, especially when the legal questions involved require careful review. Yet as people began gathering their papers and preparing to leave the courtroom, it became clear that the most memorable part of the hearing had already happened earlier, in the hallway outside the courtroom. The conversation among observers quickly turned to a single moment. The interruption. Reporters, who had been seated in the gallery, discussed it quietly as they compared notes. Court observers who had watched the hearing unfold spoke about the brief exchange between the judge and Bondi. For many of them, that moment had stood out more than any other part of the proceedings. It wasn't dramatic in the sense that many people expect when they imagine courtroom confrontations. There were no raised voices, no angry arguments, no explosive reactions. Instead, the moment had been defined by something much subtler: authority. Authority. When Judge Caprio decided to intervene earlier in the hearing, he had done so with calm precision. His words had been carefully chosen, his tone had remained controlled, but the message had been unmistakable. For many observers, the moment served as a reminder of something fundamental about how courtrooms function. Legal proceedings are designed to allow strong arguments. Attorneys are expected to advocate forcefully for their clients. They challenge opposing viewpoints. They present different interpretations of the law. They push their arguments as far as they can within the legal framework. That process is not only accepted in courtrooms, it is essential, but the courtroom also has structure. And at the center of that structure is the judge. The judge's responsibility is not to advocate for either side. Instead, the judge must ensure that the discussion remains grounded in the law itself. When arguments begin to drift too far beyond the legal issues at hand, the judge has both the authority and the responsibility to guide the discussion back to its proper focus. On that particular day, many observers felt that was exactly what had happened. Judge Caprio had not interrupted the hearing out of frustration or impatience. He had stepped in simply to reinforce the boundaries that define legal debate, and he had done so in a way that reflected decades of experience in the courtroom. By the time people left the building, the hearing itself had become just one part of the conversation. The moment that stayed with them was the calm but firm reminder delivered from the bench. It was the kind of moment that demonstrates how courtroom authority often works best, not through dramatic displays, but through quiet control. For those who had witnessed it firsthand, the message was clear. Courtrooms are places where arguments can be passionate. Attorneys can challenge each other vigorously. Judges can question both sides with intensity. But no matter how heated a discussion becomes, the foundation of the courtroom remains the same. The law comes first. And on that day, when the discussion began drifting slightly away from that focus, Frank Caprio made it clear where the line stood. Not through confrontation, not through raised voices, but through a calm, steady reminder that the courtroom operates under rules that everyone, attorneys, observers, and even the most experienced advocates, must respect. Because in the end, the strength of the legal system depends on that balance. And in that courtroom, on that particular day, the balance had been quietly but unmistakably restored. If you found this story interesting, make sure to hit the like button. And subscribe to the channel for more powerful courtroom moments and political hearing breakdowns. Also, share this video with friends who enjoy behind-the-scenes insights into major legal and political events. And don't forget to drop a comment below. Which moment surprised you the most? Your support helps the channel grow and keeps these stories coming. Thanks for watching.